Good evening, everybody. My name is Dolores Arudin, and I'm the Director of UCD's Institute of Food and Health. And you're all very welcome to the first of our public lecture series for 2021. In case any of you have missed any of the lectures from last year, they're all available on the Institute of Food and Health's website. And we have many more to look forward to in the coming year. And again, on our website, you'll be able to see the schedule of public lectures that we will host in the coming year. So thank you very much for joining us. As some of you may know, our public lecture series is designed to share our expert knowledge on the role of food and health in an accessible and understandable way. And a key tenet is to really provide you with the scientific evidence that underpins the connection between diet and health. Tonight, the talk is going to be on the very important area of the relationship between nutrition and the healthy immune function, and it'll be delivered by Professor Helen Roche. An important element of this public talks is to provide you with a platform to ask your burning questions, and we will do our utmost to take as many questions as we can at the end of Helen's talk. If you want to pose your questions, just use the function that you'll see on the screen, and then we'll have a number of people to help reply to your questions. The moderator of the question and answer session will be Professor Lorraine Brennan, and she'll be joined by Dr. Briege McNulty and from University College Dublin and Dr. Fred Sheedy from Trinity College Dublin. So I'll pass you over now to Professor Lorraine Brennan, and she'll introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Helen Roche. Thank you, Lorraine.
Thank you very much, Dolores. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers and our panel members tonight. So Helen initially trained in human nutrition and dietetics in Trinity College Dublin, and she followed there and stayed there to do a PhD. Following this, she moved to the University of Cambridge to train with Steve O'Rahilly. In 2000, she returned back to Ireland and she established her nutrigenomics team in Trinity. In 2007, Helen moved to UCD with the establishment of the Institute of Food and Health here in UCD. Helen formerly chaired the EU Healthy Diet for a Healthy Life Scientific Advisory Board, and she currently advises the National Nutrition Research Committee in the UK. She's a member of the board of the RCSI and is a CORU registered dietitian. So I'm sure we're going to get an excellent talk tonight about the importance of nutrition and immune function. At the end, we're going to be joined by Assistant Professor Frederick Sheedy from Trinity College. He leads a group in Trinity looking at macrophage homeostasis. And his major research focus is in the regulation of macrophage antimicrobial responses by metabolism and dietary components, and defining how systemic metabolic disorders impact homeostatic macrophage function. And our colleague, Assistant Professor Briege McNulty, will also join the panel. And Briege, for over the past 12 years, has managed the National Food Consumption Surveys in Ireland. She's collecting dietary data and lifestyle data from 1-year-old to over 65-year-olds in Ireland. And her main research interests are in using this data to gain an understanding of the impact of nutrients, food ingredients and chemicals on health, with a view to underpinning food safety and policy. So with that, I'll hand back to Helen and ask her to start her presentation.
Great, thanks Lorraine, and thank you very much Dolores for the introduction. As they have said, I'm going to talk about nutrition and immune function, and I'm very glad to have both Briege and Fred together with me in terms of answering all of your questions, because I'm sure I won't answer all of yours. And the reason why I asked Fred to join me is because Fred and I, we worked together on an SFI funded project looking at the impact of different nutritional elements on immune function. And he's the hardcore immunologist. And then Briege, as Lorraine mentioned, she leads the dietary assessment elements of the National Nutrition Survey. So she really has all the details in relation to ideal intakes and habitual intakes in Ireland at her fingertips. So I think this year it can be safely said that immune system status and also healthy immune function is one of the most significant public health issues. Now, of course, your immune status is affected by a number of things, not only diet. For example, genetics, your infection history, your vaccination history, perhaps stress can affect it. diet, of course, which we'll speak about, age, which I'll touch on a little bit, also your body weight, whether you're underweight or overweight, and also physical activity. And specifically from the nutritional perspective, I'm going to focus on energy, amino acid or protein levels, and also some micronutrients, specifically vitamin D, selenium, and zinc. And before I get into the nutrition part, I wanted to give you a very simple introduction to your immune system. Essentially, there are two arms. You've got the innate or the natural arm, and then you've got the adaptive arm. And they work together really well when it's functioning well. So both elements are involved in protection. So innate immunity will protect and exclude infections and also aberrant cell growth to an extent. And then you've got the adaptive immune response, where you've got B cells and T cells. And I'm sure with all the controversy in relation to vaccines, you'll have heard about antibodies. So essentially the B cells make those antibodies so that then you can fight a subsequent infection. And as I said, the main element is to exclude pathogens and also to exclude and remove aberrant cell growth or tumor cell growth. But that immune cell also identifies and recognizes pathogens which shouldn't be there. That could be a virus or a bacterial agent. It then eliminates it as fast as possible, but then also it has this element of memory. And that's why we need vaccines, in order to give our body that memory in relation to, say, in this case, COVID-19, so that you can essentially clear that as quickly as possible. Now, today I want to, because the immune system is so complicated, I want to propose a concept known as immune fitness. And this is a concept which I picked up from the Dutch. And essentially, I helped the Dutch with a grant program where they're looking at the impact of nutrition on immune fitness. And the reason why they're doing this is because we've learned over the last 5 to 10 years that the rate and the ability the immune system has to mount an effective response is based on their metabolism. So that's where I'm taking the analogy of fitness. And when that metabolic profile is just right, you get maximal protection. So within the context of immune fitness, I'm going to explore different elements of food and nutrition, physical activity, and also age, and how they affect our ability to mount this barrier. And very simply, optimal nutrient supply from a varied diet will lead to a state of optimal nutritional status and stores. And then that will give you the ability to mount an optimal immune function, and therefore you'll have good protection and you will have good defense. And the way in which nutrition impacts this immune fitness comes from a number of elements. For example, food and nutrition provides fuels or the energy to mount the immune response. An immune response to generate inflammation, to clear an infection, actually takes a huge amount of energy. Also, the diet provides the building blocks to make components of the immune response. For example, the building blocks of proteins, such as amino acids, actually go forward and form the immune proteins, such as antibodies and cytokines, which are chemicals which are used to kill invading cells. Other micronutrients particularly, they regulate the nature of the immune cell response. So things like zinc, vitamin A, selenium, they act as cofactors for some of the enzymes. Some specific micronutrients, and I'll talk about these in detail later, such as selenium and zinc, have particular antiviral roles. And also when you mount an inflammatory response, you need that response at a certain time, but then you need to pull it back and switch it off. And within that context, a lot of the antioxidant and also inflammatory or anti-inflammatory nutrients such as vitamin C, vitamin E, again, zinc, copper, and selenium, and some phytochemicals, which are the non-nutritive food components, which are present in fruit and veg. They're essentially those high-colored elements. So you get those elements all across the diet. Now, one area which we've been working on over the last number of years is the impact of obesity on the inflammatory response. And indeed, both obesity and inactivity are associated with a chronic low-grade level of inflammation. It's as if the inflammatory cells are sort of revved up And then when they do mount an inflammatory response, sometimes it can be too much. And over the last couple of years, within the context of obesity, it is very evident that the immune cells are essentially in that context and they're not primed to the best way that they could. A few months ago, Fred and I were asked to write a review in relation to the impact of obesity, COVID-19 and immunometabolism. And indeed, this review was led by a former trainee of Fred's, Laura Gleason. And Laura had a baptism of fire, as in she was a medic and she worked from January last year in St. Vincent's Hospital in ICU. And she was very struck by the fact that most of her clients who were very ill at the time were carrying extra weight. And one of the reasons why those individuals were so sick when they got COVID is because you get the convergence of 3 different elements happening simultaneously. Somebody who's carrying more weight has this sort of primed or pro-inflammatory state. They also have higher levels of lipids and glucose, which dysregulate metabolism within the immune system. So what happens in that case is that the individual who's obese or carrying extra weight is more susceptible to the primary airway infection. Then the system is a bit sluggish in terms of getting that early immune containment off the ground. But then the whole inflammatory system nearly bubbles over and you get what is known as the cytokine storm, and you get too much pulmonary or lung inflammation. And that's why people are so dependent on oxygen and ventilators. However, if you are carrying weight, do not underestimate the impact of physical fitness. Again, some of the work that I've helped scientists review in the Netherlands is coming very strong, nice data, which does demonstrate that improving your physical fitness also impacts the fitness of your immune cell. So I'm not advocating a crash diet to lose your weight, but I am advocating that you do set yourself goals and you do try to increase your physical fitness, say at least 3 times a day. And on the other hand, the immune system is a bit like a balancing act. You just want the right amount, not too much, not too little, because indeed it has been demonstrated that elite athletes who train and overtrain, their immune response nearly gets exhausted. And also they're more susceptible to infections. So it really is this fine balance. Another element I want to talk to you is about the interaction between food and nutritional status and also age, because the older population is probably our most important element or cohort within the population. And with the context of living and the life cycle, our nutritional needs change a lot over time. And they change because we've got different demands for growth and repair at different stages of life. And indeed, the rate of growth and repair, which we refer to as turnover, declines with age. And with age, you get this element known as immunosenescence. So your immune cells are not quite as perky and responsive as they would have been when you were younger. And so with that, we have to be very mindful, because on one hand, what I'm presenting to you here is that our energy requirements reduce with age. So what this slide shows is essentially energy intake in men in the solid line versus females. So at the age about 20, your energy intake levels as a man peak, and also for a woman, but then also they go down. And if you look at beyond 50 or beyond 70, like your energy intake levels are at least 30% lower, if not 40% lower. However, at this time, even though your energy requirements aren't that high, your requirements for amino acids and all the micronutrients are still elevated. So it's really important that you have high quality in the diet at this time of your life. One of the micronutrients I'm going to focus on is vitamin D. Vitamin D is a little bit of a misnomer because an essential nutrient is one, in theory, which we cannot make in the body. Vitamin D is a little bit different because it is the only nutrient per se where the main source is not one of diet, but also from UVB or sun exposure. However, that sun exposure must be between 290 and 315 wavelengths. And essentially at our latitude, we don't get enough sun to convert the pro-vitamin D, which is in our skin, into the active form. And so in the UK and also in Ireland, we only make vitamin D from sunlight between April and September. Now, within the context of vitamin D, there has been a lot of controversy as to whether supplementation will actually improve your immune status or not. And it is quite controversial. So I liaised with a colleague in the UK, Professor Sue Lanham-New, who's based at the University of Surrey, and she's an expert in the whole vitamin D area. And firstly, it has been shown that there is a very strong association between, say, risk of flu and vitamin D status. So what is in this slide shows that the number or the incidence in respiratory infections in the black bars from January, of course, they're very high, and then they go down, and then they go back up heading into November and December. And you will see in the gray bars that represents habitual vitamin D intake, and you see it moves in the opposite direction. So that has led some people to propose that perhaps there is an association between vitamin D status and also infection. And one of the reasons why it's sort of thought that there may be some evidence to suggest this is that for whatever reason, immune cells express the vitamin D receptor in their nucleus. Also, immune cells have the ability to produce the active form of vitamin D. And vitamin D supports the function of B cells and T cells, and those cells that present antigens or the invaders to the immune system. So they may be antibacterial or antiviral. So this suggests a role for vitamin D in maintaining immune homeostasis. That is that nice balance in vitamin status. Now, there's been a lot of data and a lot of controversy in relation to the interrelationship between COVID-19 risk and also vitamin D status. And at this stage, there are at least 40 papers associating low vitamin D status with the greater incidence and also severity of COVID-19. This is an example of one paper which was published in Israel. And indeed, it does look that particularly vitamin D deficiency may aggravate COVID-19 either, but it's very important to appreciate that it's probably deficiency. In order to demonstrate that something is true or not, we have randomized controlled trials, which are blinded. But of course, in a national or a global emergency such as this, you can't construct such trials. So therefore, this is a study which was completed in frail elderly individuals who got COVID-19. It's a small study, only 77 patients with an average age of 88 years. And they were divided into 3 groups. Those subjects who had prior exposure to vitamin D supplementation for at least a year, they were taking their vitamin D supplements. Those individuals who got vitamin D post-hospitalization when they had COVID, and then those individuals who did not have vitamin D. And you can see, essentially, this is a survival curve. So essentially, those individuals who did have vitamin D status or supplementation, and therefore their status prior to COVID, did survive better. Nevertheless, one of the UK scientific committees in relation to this, that is the National Institute for Health and Core Excellence, did conclude that there was no evidence to support that taking vitamin D supplement would specifically prevent COVID. So that's important. So your low status is not good in terms of your antiviral ability, but taking it won't necessarily prevent you getting it at all. And sometimes that message can get mixed up in the media. And indeed, in Ireland, the Irish government and the Food Safety Authority also went along the lines as the UK agencies last November. However, vitamin D levels are fairly difficult to attain. So we're supposed to consume approximately 10 micrograms per day. But 10 micrograms is the equivalent of eating 6 eggs, approximately 1.3 litres of a fortified dairy-free milk alternative. Now, the natural milks, as in milk from a cow, and particularly those which are fortified, such as super milk, do actually contain quite a lot. Fortified cereals, they also contain quite a lot. But again, you'd have to consume about 4 bowls to make that recommendation, and also a tin of sardines. So that's the vitamin D story. Now I'm going to move on to zinc. And again, zinc is a micronutrient. And again, I'm coming back to this whole area of balance because in the case of deficiency, when you do not have enough zinc in your diet, you are associated with immunosuppression. Zinc homeostasis is fine, but then again, zinc excess, too much, actually has also been demonstrated to inhibit immune cell function. And indeed, zinc deficiency is quite common globally, approximately 17% of the population. However, this morning I was speaking to Breed because she's so familiar with the nutritional and dietary assessment data. Essentially, from the Irish perspective, we seem to be okay from the zinc perspective. But just to let you know, the reason why zinc is important is because it inhibits an enzyme which is critical to viral replication, an enzyme known as RNA-dependent polymerase. But essentially, zinc inhibits that enzyme, so it inhibits any virus from replicating. And to this end, there is a lot of evidence out there in relation to either zinc status. If it's low, you may be more prone to COVID-19, but also using zinc as part of the treatment regime in terms of the COVID response. Selenium is the last nutrient I'm going to look at. And essentially selenium, another micronutrient, again, deficiency is associated with immunosuppression, whereas optimal status, essentially your T cells will work properly, and also you will get a stronger vaccine response, and therefore your immune system works better. Interestingly, the adequate intake, which is recommended, is 70 micrograms for selenium. The average intake in Ireland is approximately 71. However, with Breed's data, when she splits it down into either men versus women, it's actually women who have levels of consumption which are lower than that 70 target. And the reason for that is probably down to portion size, because as you'll see later, a lot of the dietary sources are related to meats, the very rich foods, eggs, and some pulses and vegetables. But interestingly, again, in relation to the impact of selenium status on viral risk, this was an ICE study which showed that increasing selenium intake improves immune function to poliovirus. And this is data taken from quite a while ago, but essentially what it demonstrated was that selenium increased T cell function in response to the poliovirus by increasing the level of this particular cytokine known as interferon gamma. Recently, because of course COVID came along, there have been studies looking at the interrelationship here. This is data taken from Margaret Raymond, who's based at the University of Surrey. She's an expert in selenium status. And essentially what she did was she mapped the level of the number of cases, which is on the y-axis here, and the amount of selenium in hair in China. And for those individuals who had low selenium status, essentially their cure rate, or those individuals, their cure rate was lower. So lower selenium status, lower cure rate. Whereas those individuals who are at the higher part end of the scale, essentially they demonstrated a greater ability for cure. But again, this is an association. Nevertheless, there have been some other studies which show that, essentially a lot of the patients who are hospitalized as a result of COVID-19 were down in their selenium levels. And certainly those individuals who were deficient had a greater risk of needing ventilation and also, unfortunately, death. But it's very important to note that a lot of the populations here were very old individuals who were malnourished. And this last slide, which I've taken again, would suggest that selenium deficiency is associated with mortality and risk from COVID-19. So essentially what they've done here is plot the level of selenium in people's in their blood, and also the levels of the selenoproteins, which are these enzymes which promote selenium function in the immune system. They were very low in those individuals who unfortunately passed away, much lower than controls, and compared to those individuals who recovered and were discharged. So what do you do as Joe Public in terms of making sure that your vitamin D levels are high, your zinc is optimal, and your selenium levels are good? Well, essentially, I want you to look at all these different foods. And I want you to think, actually, there's a lot of commonalities. So zinc and selenium, you're seeing a lot of meat in both. You see eggs for vitamin D. You see nuts and pulses, all really good, rich foods, which you should include as part of your diet. But what I would suggest to you, and maybe not necessarily criticizing the studies that have gone before, but very often nutritionists just look at fat, or they just look at vitamin D, or they just look at selenium. And it's probable that those individuals who were deplete in vitamin D were probably also deplete in a lot of other nutrients. And our understanding of malnutrition, or being low in these micronutrients, has moved on. A malnourished patient is not only the patient where you look at somebody and you can quite clearly see that their body weight is low. Because indeed, a lot of people, even though they're carrying extra body weight, their levels of those micronutrients are not necessarily optimal. And that's why it's very important to think about your diet if you do want to lose those COVID pounds, as it were. So in terms of some recommendations, I'd say to you quite simply, go to the food pyramid and make sure that you're getting at least 3 portions out of the shelf, which is related to meat, poultry, fish, eggs, the beans, the nuts, and the lentils. Make sure you're also getting your 3 portions at least of milk, yogurt, and cheese. And then also the fruit and vegetables on the bottom, at least 5 to 7 portions. And if you are trying to lose weight, well then miss the top of the pyramid, or if you're trying to gain weight, of course, use them as well. And then combine that, of course, with physical activity, because I might be a nutrition specialist, but certainly diet and physical activity, they work hand in glove, and one does not work without the other. Before I wrap up, I thought I should give you some concluding remarks, because this whole area of inflammation, anti-inflammatory foods, even I was trying to register somebody for this talk, and I Googled, say, nutrition immune function seminar, and there were loads of seminars coming up. And a lot of them were sort of sponsored for different reasons. So I have no affiliations with anyone. I'm not necessarily selling a product. But the European Food Safety Authority, which is the authority which lets us put labels on food to say, this is a high level of vitamin D, vitamin C, whatever. So EFSA permits claims for the maintenance of function of the immune system for vitamin A, B6, B12, and D, for folate, for zinc and selenium and copper. And that data really is in terms of trying to prevent deficiency. And it's important to note that certainly in the case of, say, zinc, certainly in the case of vitamin D, you do not want to be deficient or deplete. But also you don't want, just because one supplement works, that doesn't mean that 2 supplements will work twice as well. Also the whole area of inflammation and foods that fight inflammation. And we've been working in this space for quite some time. And I think indeed we have to switch our perspective on this, because initially we thought, okay, inflammation, you just attenuate it or reduce it by putting anti-inflammatory nutrients there. But because we've learned that actually the whole metabolism of those cells, that's what is wrong. Rather than just putting anti-inflammatories on, we have to think about what are the elements in the diet which are actually fueling that immune metabolism, and how can we manipulate that to a certain extent such that you keep that immune response in the most robust and fit way. Again, as much with the diet as physical activity and general well-being. Now, I'm sure you're interested in this topic, and I guess you are because you signed on and you've joined this lecture. But I've also put some links here, links in terms of recommendations or sources of reputable information from Healthy Ireland, the HSE, and also say in relation to both diet and physical activity. I've also put in one link for a colleague's book, because I didn't mention cancer, say, for example, or somebody who's lost weight because of whatever condition you have. Essentially, in that situation, you have to be very careful. You are going to be immunocompromised, and you want to pep that person up as much as you can. But an excellent book was actually published last year by Dr. Aoife Ryan, who's based in UCC, who released a cookbook, which in terms of cancer prevention. And it really is, it's a mine of information. And also, if you do have specific clinical needs, you need to make sure that you join up or meet with a reputable dietitian or a qualified nutritionist. And essentially, that's the reason why I put the link in there with the INDI. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge two colleagues who I conversed with in relation to making sure I was up to speed in relation to COVID-19 and selenium status and vitamin D status, namely Philip Calder and also Sue Lanham-New. And also I'd like to very much thank Fred and also Breed for their time and effort to come and also join me today. And we would be more than welcome to take some of your questions.